I will start off. Hello, welcome. Really appreciate everyone joining in today on this Saturday, wherever you are in the world and whatever time zone you're in. We have people on this panel and listening from all around the world, and it's really beautiful. I want to first say that grab my notes. That what we're going to be doing is there's 4 of us on this in this space for deciding for ourselves today, and we're going to be sharing thoughts, each of us, for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then for the remaining half hour or so, we're going to have a dialogue between us. And we are using this very awkward, to my mind, format. But we've decided to have no chat and not take questions, so we can kind of stay present with listening to each other and responding to each other, and trying to make it as for us as face-to-face and as experience as possible. And I just hold up a copy of Deciding for Ourselves, beautifully designed book. So I want to start off by thanking everyone that contributed, AK Press for publishing it and for hosting this event, along with Radical May. But I really want to thank all the contributors. I will, just so I don't forget anyone. We have 4 in the call, 3 on the call besides me. But I want to thank Stefano for looking at Barcelona, Modibo and Andrew for the Pan-African tradition and what they call intimate direct democracy. I love that word. Jacqueline and Roberto, who looked at Puerto Rico. Shannon Chief and Laurence, who looked at Anishinaabe Nation and restoring the old ways. Nico, who looked at Viome and Notara in Greece, 2 forms of self-management. Cynthia, who looks at a space of within Brazil. And the last person is Natasha, who looks at a really lovely space of the lentil, squatted land in Dijon, France. And then of the 3 people joining me today, and I will not pronounce their names well, so excuse me in advance, is Aspijon, speaking from Copenhagen about Kristiania. Scott is going to be speaking about, also I'll mispronounce it, Cheran, Mexico. And Lar is going to be speaking about Rojava. So each of them will turn to in a minute, and you'll have me for the next 10 minutes till then. So I also wanted to, before I sort of begin, to just frame a few thoughts about this collection. I just want to acknowledge the stolen land and stolen lives for thousands of years ago until now, that when we talk about deciding for ourselves, to keep in mind that we hold that with us. And to my mind, that's why we fight so hard to have spaces of life and of freedom, is because we know those land and lives have been stolen from us so many times and continue to be. So I want to hold that with us today. So I'm going to, again, for about 10 minutes, talk about this collection, which I curated. I like the word curation better than edited. To my mind, doing these collections is bringing a collection of people together and, in a way, having a dialogue with them while the process of putting something together and having the pieces have a dialogue together in the collection too. So to my mind, it's curating a portrait or a picture together. I think of anthologies that way, not just like these discrete individual pieces. I did another collection, which I want to kind of toss out there before this one, which I think is equally powerful for this moment, which is called Rebellious Mourning, the Collective Work of Grief. And it too is a collection of stories that really speak to sort of frontline and heartfelt, vulnerable and honest stories, which is what this collection, Deciding for Ourselves, does. This is such a bittersweet moment for this book to come out. When I and everyone else was working on it for the past year and a half, we envisioned having face-to-face conversations. And one reason why I love doing these anthologies is also to create those spaces afterward, to create magical spaces. That's part of what I like doing as an anarchist, where we can talk together and dialogue and think together about how we would bring these ideas into the real world. They're already in the real world, though, in this book. So it's a bittersweet moment because we can't do that face-to-face. But at the same time, it's perhaps an even more relevant moment for this collection to be gifted out into this world. I really do feel like it's a gift right now. It's all the more relevant and maybe all the more poignant and all the more needed for our hearts right now. to look at what it means. And all the examples in the book do this. They look at large scale, actually existing, ongoing and or long-lived spaces of self-determination and self-governance, spaces where people decide for themselves. This book is not some academic, if we did it this way, what would happen? This book is grounded in the real world of spaces that continue to exist through this moment. So I feel like that why this book, in a way for us to think about what it looks like to do these things in this moment, isn't a hypothetical question. There are places we can look to for inspiration. I think it's also all the more relevant in relation to the fact that it's no surprise to most of us probably listening or here, but for many, many people, this COVID catastrophe is revealing the profound inability of capitalism, colonialism, the state, patriarchy, and we could name other things, but those especially, the state and capitalism, I will name right hugely, to take care of anyone at this moment. A lot of us already know that, but it's making it abundantly clear. But besides that, we're heading into a period where likely those structures may collapse. And I personally feel we're at a remarkable and really scary crossroads, where we are heading toward more of fascistic structures or ecocide, or what I would call everyday anarchism, which is what I think this book holds. Everyday practices, who cares what they're called? I'm less interested in whether we call them direct democracy, self-governance, anarchism, zapatismo. We could name the host of ways people have named these things. What to me is so profound about this book is it shows us the lived practices, the messy, beautiful experiments of people trying to make lives worth living, of lessening death and suffering, and creating spaces of well-being and qualitatively better spaces. So to me, this book is a carrier of everyday anarchism, and I think that is the fight right now. At this moment, there's been a gigantic emergence of beautiful mutual aid efforts to fill in the collapse of state and capital. And so I know a lot of people have been thinking about how can those spaces of mutual aid expand out to move beyond sheer survival, to think about how we will thrive, how we will be the carriers of life forward from this moment. When I talked about curating this collection, for me, it was painting a picture of promise. I think that's promise. I talk about this in the introduction to it. I'm less interested in the question of sort of hope. To me, hope is this still sort of a pie in the sky, especially at this moment. And to me, promise embodies exactly what I understand self-governance and self-determination to be. It's we look each other in the eye, we're with each other in community, and we look at each other and we say, what can we pledge together to do? What can we promise each other? What can we voluntarily commit to? And that involves deep trust and a deep social fabric and a deep willingness to step into the messy, beautiful experiments together and promise that we'll try as hard as we can to make this so much better than other spaces that we're forced to live in. So I really hope this book is about painting that picture of the promise. It's a sampler that's suggestive, not exhaustive, inspirational, but not a model. And in fact, I was doing a podcast about it with Coffee with Comrades, a lovely podcast. And on that podcast, Pearson pointed out that the book is really talking about its direct democracies. So I really want to highlight that. I tried hard to curate this collection to show, rather than sort of like direct democracy is this one thing that happened at one time, or that someone theorized, or that someone came up with the idea, or that happened in a certain place or time, that whatever word we want to use for this, but direct democracies are how humans for thousands of years till now have chosen to engage in the common sense of figuring out how they want to run their lives together and how they want to determine their lives together, how they want to fulfill what they need and desire and want together without some top-down structures or outside forces. And so in a way, it has to be direct democracies. And what this book, I think, so beautifully illustrates, I'm so grateful every time I reread it, which I read many times in the process of curating it, is the pieces show different parts of what potentially we might begin to think about being direct democracies, this constellation of beautiful ways to do it based on the specific traditions, contexts, land, terrain, languages, cultures, I could go on and on and on, but the vast diversity of what a context is precisely how people figure out what kind of a direct democracy or self-governance or self-determination they need in their space. And so each of these pieces illustrates different people talking about how they have done that and showing how they've done that in vastly different circumstances. And each of these circumstances, I think, again, to make this book really relevant to these times, I think it's profoundly relevant, especially in hindsight, rereading this book after the last 2 months, which have seemed like 2 years of this COVID catastrophe. Each of them takes place in contexts that involve war or fascism, profound displacement or gentrification, years of colonial devastation, climate catastrophe. We could name other disasters that these are happening within, and yet they're still happening. They're still able to be there. They're able to exist. They're able to be real. And I think that's what makes them all the more beautiful. And all these pieces people grapple with, again, not just this romantic notion of how it could work, but how it works when people want it, to try to do it in these spaces, to not live under fascism or war or displacement, to try to create space for themselves. And I asked each of the contributors to try to sort of show the dilemmas that they face within doing that. And I was really struck in the process of this, that in each and every case, despite all the dilemmas, despite the problems, despite the things that are hard to figure out, that will take more than 10 years of a space existing or more than 30 or 40 years of a space existing to really bloom into what the kind of world we dream of in practice. Each of the spaces reveals that people's lives are qualitatively more beautiful, more joyful, that people are able to hold their sorrows better, their problems better, the beauty of their lives together. They're able to get a lot more abundant care together. It really shows that even, that this works. So I will end on that. I wanted to end on a beautiful, one of the contributors, Natasha, who talked about the space that Natasha has been living in for about, it's a space that's existed for about 11 years in France. And it's the last piece that ends the book, because in that piece, they really grapple with what happened when they faced a lot of crises around their own internal sort of forms of racism they were coming up against, for instance, as they transitioned into a space that is completely heterogeneous as opposed to homogeneous, and how they handled that. And in that piece, she talks about no matter how hard it gets, and it's still getting, because they're still there, that they continually feel this sense of freedom in the air. I really thought that was such a beautiful phrase, a sense of freedom in the air, especially at this moment when it's so hard to feel that. So I want to pass it on to the first person who's contributing to this. And I really appreciate, again, everyone being here. So find my notes of who we decided would go next. Sorry for my haphazard. Great. Oh, great. You know who you're going next. I'll turn it over to our look at Kristiania in Copenhagen.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Asbjørn, and I am, well, I guess now I can call myself a writer and freelance journalist based in Copenhagen. And Cindy asked me to write a piece about the free town Kristiania, which is an area located pretty much at the center of Copenhagen, about 800 residents on the former fortifications of an old star fort around Copenhagen. And well, it's been there since 1971, which makes it one of the oldest utopias that you can find of this kind, which both posed a challenge because there was a lot to discover, but also there's like a very wide variety of opinions on it. So deciding on whether to interview old or young people was a challenge. But actually, the most remarkable was that it took an outsider, meaning Cindy, to actually prompt me to write this, because I've been living in Copenhagen for a while. But to people in Copenhagen, Kristiania often doesn't seem like something very special. It's the place where you go to get weed, or at least tourists do. But it was quite the journey to to rediscover it. So Kristiania functions as sort of in symbiosis with the surrounding area. It has its own water system. It has its own controlling system. It gets power from the outside, of course, and being located in the city, it's not self-sufficient, but it contributes a lot to Copenhagen. It's pretty much the biggest tourist attraction, including royal castles and all manner of things that one see in a metropolis. And it also has managed to maintain its structure despite several attacks by the state and despite its a sort of a problematic, another problematic symbiosis with the drugs which are dealt there, or at least cannabis, if you see that as a drug. And also writing this piece met a lot of skepticism from other leftists, because they asked, why would I want to read about Kristiania? Because it's, especially on the radical left, it's seen as a flawed utopia. But reading this book, I've realized that it's not a bad thing, because it still is a utopian model. It's so much better than everything else, but also through the flaws and seeing that it's such a small community, it gives an opportunity to study like the micro model of autonomous communities. For example, reading Dilar's piece on Rojava, we're talking about millions of people, or Scott's model on Cheran in Mexico, hope I pronounced that right, still thousands of people. This is like I imagine this must have been what it could be like to zoom in on one of the building blocks of neighborhoods consisting of utopias. So you can really discover the things, and I got to talk to neighbors and how they got along with each other, all the way up to the Council of Kristiania and their historian and stuff. So I'm not going to talk so much about the flaws, but the current problematics is that Kristiania exists, but it has reached the limits of its physical expansion, but also of its autonomy. Mostly because the city of Copenhagen won't allow Kristiania to expand or do major renovations, because cannabis is still sold there, and they use that as a pretext of connecting Kristiania with the gangs which are selling there. But there is a division between gangs which sells at Kristiania and the residents there. But because they maintain such a strong system of consensus democracy, gangs such as Hells Angels or others have actually managed to, I wouldn't say infiltrate, because some of them are actually residents there and do practice this system, but have another value system which sort of undermines it, and which is setting the scene for Kristiania today. Yeah. I know there wasn't 10 minutes, but I hope I can contribute to something later. Also, I guess I wanted to mention that writing from a Western metropolis, this is by all means a very privileged utopia. Even though the state is against Kristiania, it's still tolerated. There's no direct attacks, except that police often patrol there, but there's no forced evictions anymore. Kristiania has managed to buy itself from the state. And even though there's gang violence, there's not direct armed incursions from groups who wants to directly remove it. So it also gives an insight into how something can still exist in the heart of capitalist Europe.
Great.
So, should I go?
Sure. Yeah. Next
yeah.
Right on. Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Campbell. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and to Cindy and AK for bringing us together. And I wrote about Cheran, but before I sort of dive into that, I wanted to acknowledge that, as is readily evident, I'm a gringo settler. I'm not from Cheran, and I don't try to speak for Cheran. I know a little bit about the place, but it's not an experience I've lived, and obviously my personal and socially constructed identity is different from that of those in Cheran. And what I tried to do in the piece, and what I'll try to do here, is sort of offer a narrative based on that which was shared with me through interviews and documents and research. So to dive in, Cheran is an indigenous Purépecha municipality in Michoacán, Mexico, of about 20,000 people, with another 10,000 who have migrated primarily to the United States. And there's a lot that comes before this, but I'm going to start in 2011, when Cheran was facing essentially sort of communal disintegration as a result of divisions due to political parties, fear and violence due to cartels, and in particular, the destruction of their communally held forest, which was done by loggers linked to organized crime, facilitated by the municipal police and the municipal government. And in total, they deforested nearly 50,000 acres of this community's land. So it came to a point where a group of women decided that, enough was enough. They had to do something. All these outside forces that had been imposed on the community through violence, force, and coercion were wreaking nothing but havoc, creating distrust, fear, disappearances, murders, extortion, all that sort of thing. And so on the morning of April 15th, 2011, a group of women gathered, rang the bells of the church, called out the community, and blockaded one of the logging trucks as it was heading through town. The 5 loggers were detained, the truck was set on fire. The youth fanned out throughout the community, urging people to come to the streets, saying, it's time to defend Cheran, it's time to lose our fear. And later in the day, there were clashes between the cartels, municipal police, and the community, which the community successfully defended themselves. And as a result, sort of a spontaneous action of sort of defiant desperation, these oppressive forces were swept from the community. The cartels were gone, the municipal police were gone, the municipal authorities were gone, and their political parties were gone. So what emerged out of that was obviously first a concern about defending the community and preparing for any counterattack from the state or cartels. So a volunteer community patrol was immediately formed as the police graciously left behind their weapons and vehicles. Barricades were erected at the entrances of the community. And I think most powerfully, on every street corner in the urban center of Cheran, a bonfire was lit. So for months, as the community was in sort of a self-imposed siege, there were 180 bonfires where people would gather, come together, discuss what was happening, discuss their vision for the future, where elders would meet with youth and share their experiences of how things were before political parties were there, before the municipal police were there, before the cartels were there. And I find that image beautiful, of night after night for months on end, of people coming together and having a conversation and knowing that you're at one bonfire and there's 179 other bonfires where the same exact thing is happening for months on end. And this was really the impetus that brought the community back together, that rebuilt that trust that had been lost, that overcame that fear that they had been existing in for years. And it was really a space of re-encounter for people to get to know one another and overcome those barriers and obstacles that had been placed in front of them as a result of these outside forces. So there's a lot. I don't want to dive too much into the details, but 2 days after the uprising, they held their first community assembly, where the main demand that emerged was absolutely no return of political parties. And to this day, political parties are banned in Cheran. Political party propaganda is prohibited. They don't allow for the installation of voting booths for state or federal elections. And through these early assemblies, they also created a lot of commissions to dialogue with the state to prepare self-defense measures and to meet the needs of the 20,000 inhabitants of the community. And over the months, what emerged out of that initial response to the crisis was an autonomous communal government. They held their first, what they call nombramientos, which are like namings or assignments. We would call them elections, but elections is not a word that's used in Cheran. Elections are associated with sort of individualism and division and violence. And how the communal government functions and how positions are filled are directly linked to that which was created in the uprising. So so when there's a nombramiento that happens, the bonfires gather together, and even though they're not, sorry, there's a bug flying distracting me. Even when the bonfires aren't physically present anymore, but they're still the most local point of organization for the community. And so when there's a nombramiento, which happens every 3 years, the bonfires gather, they decide if any of their members would be a good fit for one of the positions that are open. And if they reach a consensus on this, then they go to the neighborhood assembly. And Cheran is divided into 4 neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has an assembly that meets more or less every week. But when a nombramiento occurs, that's when the candidates are brought forward and they're selected in each of the assemblies for the various positions. There's a council of elders, a treasurer, and 8 what are called specialized operating councils. And I think what's important to point out is that everyone that serves on these councils is a member of the community. They're not politicians, they're not technocrats, they don't even necessarily have background or expertise in the role that they'll be filling. But the respect and trust of the community is placed in them, that they can fulfill the tasks being asked of them. And it's not really a matter of prestige, but a matter of respect and trust, and sort of stepping forward to leave your personal life behind for a few years and then serve on behalf of your community and defend and move forward that which was gained in the uprising. And the councils meet all sorts of needs. It's truly incredible, but some of them include like public works, trash collection, water, public health, education, community patrol, forest protection units. They administer federal and state aid that comes in. They mobilize solidarity efforts with struggles that are occurring outside of Cheran. They do reforestation, they administer communal businesses, promote culture, the Purepecha language and identity and cosmovision, work against alcoholism and addiction, for women's rights, against gender-based violence, and rejuvenating practices of traditional medicine. Just to touch on a few. And what's, I think, really inspirational and to speak to the promise of this practice is that there are several different access points into the government, and the government firmly rests on the participation of the community. So it's the community that came together and built up this structure, and it's a clear structure that fulfills designated roles so people understand what's going on, but it's one that's also fluid and organic. So for example, in 2015, when the second nombramiento occurred, proposals were put forward in the neighborhood assemblies to add a youth council and a women's council to the communal government, and that was approved. They also put forward a measure that said that on the Council of Elders, there are 3 representatives from each neighborhood, and a measure was approved that at least one of those representatives from each neighborhood had to be a woman. So they identified some flaws and issues in their communal government, and then used the communal government process to address those. So I guess when there are issues that arise, I spoke about different access points. People can bring concerns to the bonfire level or to the neighborhood assembly, or also to the council that's meant to deal with the particular issue. And there's also the ultimate decision-making body in the community is the community assembly. So the councils and the communal government are administrative nodes, whereas the decisions and policies are decided in assembly based on consensus, usually in the neighborhood assembly, but if there's a bigger issue, then the community comes together. And if consensus can't be reached, then they just have more assemblies. And people often spoke about the endless hours of meeting in assembly trying to reach consensus. But it's a process that's been working for 9 years now. Just last month, they celebrated their 9th anniversary of autonomy. A couple other points about sort of the promise of Cheran is that, like I mentioned, it's a government firmly rooted in community at really the micro level, at a block by block level, where people come together, and that's the starting point for the communal government based on those blocks. And there's this expectation of participation in the decision-making process, and this idea that the decisions that are made collectively in the name of Cheran as a community, and therefore everyone owns those decisions. And it's the responsibility of the community to enact the decisions that are made. And as such, I go into it more in the chapter, but there's a unique construction of sort of belonging in terms of the community, where an individual identifies themselves as part of the community, as in terms of adhering to the norms and practices, and in turn the community recognizes the individual as a part of it. And so there's this sort of dual relationship that occurs that really encourages participation and involvement in that which has been built and that which needs to continue to be defended and grow. Lastly, I wanted to touch on sort of the experiential qualities of living under autonomy in a communal government. When I spoke with folks, I asked them, well, what's different now than how things were before 2011? And what consistently came up was a loss of fear. People are no longer afraid. They know one another now. They know their neighbors. They talk to each other. They've had this experience of coming together to make decisions. There's a sense of safety. A couple of the women I spoke with mentioned like they feel safe walking home at night, knowing that all is well, that nothing bad is going to happen. That when they see the community patrol go by or the community patrol stops to talk with you, they don't have to be afraid of them like they were had to be afraid of the municipal police, where you can let your kids out to play and not have to worry about anything bad happening to them. And something really beautiful that several folks spoke to is sort of the personal growth and change that they experienced as a result of participating in the communal government. Union Torres, who helped me a lot with the piece, mentions that the I has become us as a result of being in a community. Or Julio, who was on the Social Programs Council, talked about how he felt like he had become a better person as a result of working and participating in the communal government, and that through that, he understood that his personal well-being was linked to the well-being of the community, and that he had become more of a compañero and caring more and wanting to see the success not only of himself, but of his fellow community members. There's also an awareness that Cheran is seen as an example, not only for neighboring Purépecha communities who are also fighting for autonomy and facing a lot of repression, in particular next door in a place called Nahuatzin, but also nationally and internationally. And so that if they're gonna proclaim themselves to be doing something or acting in a certain way, there's this idea that they really need to walk their talk because there are a lot of eyes on them and that they're serving as an inspiration for many other communities in resistance and many other struggles for autonomy. And finally, obviously there, like Asbjorn was speaking to, like there's still flaws, there's still issues, there's still connections with the state that they have. The community has faced a lot of loss. Several community members were murdered or disappeared or kidnapped throughout the course of the struggle. But there is, when folks discuss the problems and what remains to be done, they always express confidence, faith, and trust that the mechanisms they built, as in the form of an autonomous communal government, will be sufficient to sort of meet their needs and help them through the process. That even if things aren't going right, or they have issues with a certain person on a certain council or a decision that's made, that what they have in place is the means to resolve what's going on, even if the issue is what they've put in place. They can change it and as well. So I think it really speaks to the power of people uniting, realizing their collective strength and force, and that coming together to hear all voices in a sense of solidarity and self-defense, and with this tradition of community and assembly and belonging, that what's emerged is really a powerful example of a form of direct democracy. So that's all I got.
Dilar, we'll turn to you.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Let me also start out by saying thank you, Cindy, for bringing together this amazing collection and for giving us a chance to speak about these very important and meaningful struggles happening in different parts of the world. I also wanted to thank Asbjørn and Scott for sharing a bit about their chapters. So my name is Dilar. I'm an activist of the Kurdish women's movement. I'm based in Europe. We have a confederal system in the movement, which means that we try to organize ourselves in the here and now wherever we are. So we also have a confederally organized movement in Europe. And I'm also a researcher, so I don't live in Rojava. I've visited several times, but my organizing happens in Europe. But that's actually also what I want to kind of explain a bit, is that Rojava is not, with all of its spontaneous and innovative aspects, it actually isn't something that just suddenly fell from the sky. It is based on a much longer struggle history, a legacy of resistance. And I think for us, wherever we are, it is actually important often to acknowledge existing legacies and older things that people have built, so that we can go and face to the future. And of course, we're now all going through a very difficult time with the COVID pandemic. And things have been very bad in Kurdistan and different parts. And in particular, it has affected, of course, refugees and forcibly displaced people, of which there are hundreds of thousands in the region. People have already lost their life on the way to Europe, for example. They are losing their lives as a result of war and violence, which also is a connected global issue. But also now there's a high risk of many political prisoners, especially in Iran and Turkey, dying because of the situation. In particular, Turkey has excluded political prisoners from the coronavirus amnesty. And so I wanted to acknowledge that things are, of course, very difficult, and yet people are struggling, yet people find sources of hope to resist. And when I wrote this chapter, when Cindy kindly approached me to write something on Rojava, this was before the most recent Turkish state invasion of Rojava, which started in October 2019, as a result of which hundreds of thousands of people were displaced within days, hundreds of civilians have been killed, and this is the second large-scale invasion of the Turkish state of Rojava. The first one was in Afrin in 2018, which is a region, again in Rojava, that has been occupied by the Turkish army ever since. So many of the councils and assemblies and communes, cooperatives, academies that I mentioned in the chapter have actually been destroyed. And in Afrin, for example, which is the place where the women's defense units were first established, where a lot of women's assemblies and structures were built, all of them have been totally destroyed. And now there's a structural system of violence against women that rules the region. So protecting the utopias that we have, defending them, is just as important as building them, because we see that without actual international, not just solidarity, but common struggles, these areas will always be under attack. So so I don't want to sound hopeless. I do want to focus on the things that that we need to focus on, but I cannot do that without acknowledging that the region that I'm talking about is currently undergoing yet another wave of violence. Of course, when talking about Rojava, it's important to understand that it's a very large area of land that we're talking about in a very difficult part of the world, which has seen several episodes of violence and war in over decades, in fact. But at the same time, it is a region that has a very actually decades-old history of underground organizing, because it is connected, of course, to the longer legacy of the Kurdish freedom movement, and its notion of a democracy without a state, of a stateless democracy, of communities that creates new and innovative, more radical ways of self-organization and leadership, which can turn communities into self-deciding, self-determining, self-defending societies with the political literacy and understanding of why are things happening and how can we protect ourselves from it. And it's particularly a movement that puts women's liberation at the heart of its understanding of struggle. I will get into those details, but I think the reason why I want to mention that longer struggle history is because, in fact, as Cindy also mentioned in the beginning, years of building is often required before we can actually see something grow. I mean, myself or people of my generation, we are in a way the children of a much longer struggle, and we are building on other things. So patience is one way in which we need to understand anything that we call radical or revolutionary. So partly what inspired me to write the chapter in the way I did was because I felt that with the emergence of Rojava, especially with people paying more attention because of the war against ISIS, Daesh since 2014, with people seeing images of female fighters, with people seeing that actually a lot of internationalists, anti-fascists, anarchists, socialists, feminists were going there, people actually had a very authoritarian or patriarchal understanding of what revolution is. Because of course, if we look at history, we know what kind of structures or mentalities have claimed to do revolutionary work. Of course, there's state socialism and its authoritarianism. And of course, anarchists have been at the forefront of criticizing that. But that's why I wanted to kind of stress in the chapter that the Kurdish freedom movement's understanding of revolution is not so much only about the mechanisms and structures, but also about mentality. How do we get rid of the state in our minds, in our mentalities? And for that, the women's struggle is actually very central. Because on one hand, yes, of course, it's important to have a system in place, such as assemblies and cooperatives and things like that. And I do mention them in the chapter. And as I said, they are under attack because of the current occupation. But in fact, what is the meaning of building assemblies in a community that has never been allowed to self-determine, to even identify as Kurds, whose language has been banned, who've been divorced from their lands, who've been rendered poor and speechless, basically, who even had identities stripped from them, identity cards, who didn't have citizenship, as in the case in Rojava for many people, whose place in history has been denied, basically. People often say the Kurds have not even been colonized, so even their colonized state was not really recognized as such. So in a way, so it's not so much about what we build in terms of alternatives, but for what. So I think in this case, when we look at the Kurdish freedom movement's own definition of freedom, one thing that we must acknowledge there is that it's also about the ability to realize ideals. It's not to just have an ideal to say we want a free land, we want autonomy, and have all of these abstract thoughts about what we think is freedom. but we don't even know the problems that we will experience on the way if we don't actually start to do things. But what kind of mindset do you need? What kind of approach to society do you need in order to be able to do that? In a society that has been colonized, you can't expect people to have a strong political consciousness. You cannot expect women to suddenly autonomously organize if they are not even aware of all the ways in which they are being oppressed. So consciousness raising, which is an old feminist practice actually, or political literacy, pedagogy is very, very important. And in this case, for example, that's why I try to kind of provide in the chapter the perspective of the women's movement on revolution. To what extent do we transform social relations? When you have an assembly, it's not just so much about how many minutes everybody speaks, but and that's one thing that I could often see in when people were trying to make sense of the structures in Rojava, is exactly how does decision making work, exactly how does this or that work. That's important, of course that's important, that we have an understanding of how things work, but just having equal speaking time, for example, does not necessarily mean that you have changed a lot in terms of people's approach to power, in terms of people's understanding of equality, or people often ask these big picture questions when talking about Rojava. And I say this from experience of having attended or spoken at many different events about Rojava. I was always struck by the kinds of questions that people were asking. And it was very much about how is the economy organized? Has this or that been redistributed? And while I acknowledge that these things are important for people to get a sense of, is this how we should measure actual revolutionary change, or should we look from a more bottom up perspective and look more horizontally at how have social relations changed? Do we just have more women in power, or have we created a system in which more women actually are aware of their problems and find ways of solutions? So in this sense, it's also about how do we define the radical systems that we envision. And so in general, I try to look at people's personal histories as well. So many people who are now engaged in these grassroots democratic efforts, previously they were not even allowed to go out, the women. So I was really, what kind of inspired me to write the chapter in this way is because I could see a lot of people go to Rojava, take a snapshot of what's going on, and then draw conclusions about what the system looks like. But in fact, we need to take a much more longer term perspective on, okay, can women address certain issues now that they couldn't before? What kind of new forms and ideas of leadership exist now? Because that's one thing, right? We have the co-presidency system in the Kurdish freedom movement, and often people think it's a symbolic kind of way of having one woman, one man, supposed to be gender equality, but no, it's actually about challenging power. It's actually about creating more transparent and more decentralized ways of administrating something. It's also, for the women's movement, it's a way of a more reproductive kind of understanding of leadership, so that somebody who came before you has established a freer system, so that you who come after her can build on that. So in this sense, I think many of the problems that people come up against, they wouldn't even know beforehand, right? So this idea of revolution, that this is how it has to be, these are the structures that we need, and this is a very positivistic understanding. It's also very Eurocentric, I think, in how people have been trying to understand Rojava, by putting it up, by having these critiques and kind of criteria about what they think revolution needs to look like, without actually realizing how much has changed in people's real lives. But at the same time, as I mentioned, the situation is very dangerous at the moment, which is why it comes back to how do we actually defend these utopias? Again, it's connected to the movement's notion that actually just us, ourselves, we cannot be free. When we say, for example, there can be no free society without the liberation of women, it means that there needs to be an autonomous struggle for women to be able to make a contribution to the wider liberation of society. But actually, these things are dialectically, they're connected. So just like that, there cannot be a freer Middle East without a free Rojava, a free Kurdistan. It doesn't have to be in the form of a state. It's about justice and truth-seeking. And just similarly, a new kind of internationalism, that's the idea of the Kurdish freedom movement, needs to be an internationalism between struggles, not between states. And I think this becomes clearer with every day when we look at the COVID crisis and other things, is that in fact, the new internationalism has to be between communities, between indigenous communities, between women, between social movements, between radical spaces. They need to find new ways of supporting each other, new terms of common struggle, to create spaces where we can come together and discuss perspectives. Because all of the things that I mentioned in the beginning, the global arms trade, the refugee crisis, and all of that, things that currently concern Rojava, and also now, of course, the COVID crisis means that we realize even more just how much everything is connected. We need to find spaces in which not just we are up against the state that we inhabit, for example, Kristiania in Denmark, or all of these different spaces that people mentioned. It's also to understand we're all actually up against a world system of states that is trying to oppress all of us. So in this sense, I think defending Rojava and defending all of the utopias and autonomous spaces that exist also means that we need to find new ways of relating to each other and not just focus on that individual struggle that we're engaged in. And in particular, just lastly, to mention this again, it has to come also from a feminist perspective, because feminists have been at the forefront for decades now of criticizing power, of challenging patriarchal authority, which is very similar to the state. So we need to bring these different critiques of power together, from anarchists, from socialists, from any kinds of perspective, and realize we're up against a global rise of fascism, and there is no luxury of kind of crisis in the left. We just don't have that luxury, and we need to take seriously what's happening. And the attacks on Rojava are exactly that. It's an attack on an alternative. It's condemning the people in the Middle East once again to dictatorship or war, to put them into binaries that don't have to be. We deserve freedom. We can live freely. We have the means to do that. But in order for that to happen, people need to understand that the struggles everywhere in the world are linked. So I'll leave it there.
But thank you all three so much. That was so powerful, and I feel both. Yeah, I love doing these things because everybody says everything that you want to say and fills in all sorts of different dimensions, and I really appreciate the beauty of the honest ways you all spoke about your spaces, and I really appreciate ending on this note that these spaces are spaces of processes. They're always in motion and dynamic and growing and changing, that it's not simply this caricature, which I think has come out a lot in anarchism when we talked about direct democracy. It's as if it's this sort of this static thing that exists somewhere as a structure that we either like or don't like. And I really, really appreciate all these examples and the others in this anthology is it's a constant struggle of forms of life against forms of death, and ways of how we want to prefigure and also defend what we prefigured. It's really, it isn't a structure, it's a culture, a mentality, an ethic, an ongoing process. And especially at this moment, I really want to I'm so struck when all three of you are talking. For me, curating this book was also bringing together voices that understood that all these spaces are about collective care and feminism and social solidarity, and the heart of these spaces being how we treat each other in the social relationships where we don't replicate forms of power. And all of you, I really appreciate you embody that in how you speak and how you write. And this isn't, I know we're throwing these out a lot right now. We're speaking about mutual aid, but they're not slogans. They're real lived practices that impact people's lives. So, and make us have to honor our dead too in these spaces. So what we wanted to do now, and try to have some kind of sort of face to face on a screen dialogue with each other. And I think we're just going to try to see how it works to just kind of engage with what each other said or talk. Some of the questions that Scott had thrown out ahead of time, which I really want to appreciate for which we could think about, but we could talk about anything, was how these different spaces have been impacted by or responded to pandemic, other global disasters that are ongoing. We're going to be facing probably a lot of them, and have been, that overlap each other. Another question was, what do these spaces tell us about the idea, the shape, and the practice of what it looks like to decide for ourselves? And again, I want to point to, how do these spaces actually live out and embody, not just sort of talk about or theorize about collective care and feminism, the deep forms of trust and solidarity, and really just taking care of each other in the ways we want to be cared for without states and patriarchy and capitalism and colonialism. What kind of promise are they offering us? Even though I really do want to emphasize that, again, that bittersweetness is, even as this book was going to the publisher, I'm like, I cried a lot of times proofreading the pieces, because I'm like, when this book is in print, how many of these places will still be left? That's like a real challenge. As radicals, it isn't an academic question. Our hearts want these spaces to exist. They need the spaces to exist, and they need to exist for each other, to grow other spaces, to take care for the people in them. So yeah, I'll just throw it out there for everyone who wants to jump in.
I guess I can start off. So I talked with a friend named Elin, one of the interviewers at Kristiania yesterday, and asked how the COVID-19 had affected Kristiania. I mean, like all other things, Denmark is hugely privileged. There has been less than 600 deaths here. But Kristiania it's a very public area. It's a very green area, so a lot of people come together there. So they were asked to either to patrol the area and keep more than 10 people apart, but also to take care of the community. They did what pretty much no section of Copenhagen could do. They simply shut themselves off. There's barricades at all the entrances to Kristiania with checkpoints where only residents can come in, simply to protect the surrounding community, because they don't want massive amounts of people gathering, but also to protect themselves. So they have no cases of COVID-19 in Kristiania, and they managed to contain it, while also encouraging people to do the same, while also taking care of each other. And in respects to, I was very moved to hear your last thing about how outsiders criticize Rojava, especially as anarchists. We demand the impossible, as this is the book, and oftentimes that just becomes criticizing. So we fail to see the actual structures, the promise that is in things, even though they're not perfect. Especially from an outsider, it's so easy to criticize because we're not in it. We're not necessarily, especially I'm not the one who has to sit to long meetings and stuff. And especially on the radical left here in Copenhagen, Kristiania is often seen as I said, flawed, but it's still hugely better than everything else here. And it's hard to do it. It's hard to sit through times and times of meeting, and sometimes you go, as the ones I've talked to, they've just gone home and very, very frustrated from meetings, but they come home to a community that takes care of them and still supports each other in times of crisis where everyone else wasn't. So oftentimes these structures are invisible, and we have to get outsiders to get a perspective on it, or we have to step back and see, okay, this is not perfect, but we can learn from it. And in Kristiania, I see the promise of that by the community investing in itself. Like they have a very small thing is that they have employed a social worker who takes care of old people, even though some of them are drinking themselves to death, but they don't force them to definitely quit, but they see an investment in trying to make them better, trying to keep them alive, and just going around. And it's probably a thankless job, but still, it was very pretty to see. but also how the nature has a huge impact there. It's the greenest area in all of Copenhagen, and they could have built hundreds of city blocks there. They could have been a big concrete. They could have made millions of kroners on that, but they haven't, and they continue to take care of this area. Also, it's a historical heritage site, but there's a very much invested in how they want to preserve it, and yeah, and I am still hugely awed to be in this company, even though it's a very small piece I've written about, and also hearing about the large thing, and also seeing the destruction of the structures in Afrin very much reminded me of the fragility of these things, and how privileged the area I've written about is, that there isn't that. There was under eviction a few years ago, but there's to find delicate balance of preserving it. Yes, I guess I also wanted to throw out how we can defend these things, these utopias. I mean, of course, as I saw in Rojava, there was a lot of physical things, but also the international perspective of how we can use, for example, the internet to call huge attention on this, to call into question Turkey's right to attack a completely peaceful and autonomous community, or the Mexican and gangs incursions into Cheran, and how it might seem that it doesn't have a direct impact. It doesn't stop the bulldozers. It doesn't stop the Turkish soldiers, but it does still raise an awareness, and how we should think about how we can sometimes break through that wall of massive media coverage and instill a sense of outrage in people, even though they might not be anarchists, but still is able to make some situational impact. I don't have an answer to that. It's just something I thought about.
Yeah.
I guess I could share some reflections. I think to speak to sort of what's happening in Cheran with the pandemic. I last checked on Wednesday, but as of then, there were no cases in the community, and they've done what many Indigenous communities in particular have done, which is sort of lock themselves down, because as folks are probably aware, like on a good day, the healthcare system in Mexico is inadequate, and now is not a good day. And especially in rural and Indigenous communities, there is limited or no access to healthcare. Cheran is a little different because it's somewhat urban. It has a basic hospital and doctor's offices and that sort of thing. But they've taken some of the practical measures we've heard about. Like there's a 10 o'clock curfew, the barricades which remain, entrance to the town is barred at 8 p.m. and the community patrol that works at the barricades has a sort just does a health check on everyone coming into the community. And I think, there's things like physical distancing and everyone's supposed to wear a mask. But some of the more notable things they've done is the neighborhood assemblies have organized both the sale of low-cost food and supplies for people who need it, and also free food and supplies if someone has an inability to pay. So to make sure that everyone in the community has their needs met during this time, especially if they can't go to work or travel outside the community to sell. And there's been a strong focus on avoiding spreading false information, and they've established a hotline for people to call if they have concerns about their health or any questions. And it's interesting looking at they've been putting out a lot of videos and statements, and just the general, like, of course, all this is being done by the communal government, which is the people of Cheran, and through the Public Health Commission, which is part of the Civic Affairs Council, working with the Social Programs Council, and it's a great example of sort of the government in action, meeting the needs of the people in a way, because they, the government is rooted in the people. So there's not, when you watch their videos or read their statements, there's nothing about all the garbage that we're familiar with here. There's no politics involved. There's no blaming involved. There's no fear or demands or chastising. It's a sense of like, here are the measures we're taking for the well-being of all of us. And it's a very communal form of communication. And they end everything saying like, we have a joint responsibility through all of this together to see our way through this as a community. And so that's been sort of the focus. And fortunately, they've so far avoided at least any confirmed cases. I think, can I address another question? Or do you want to say something?
If are you finished with your point, or sorry? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I would like to just draw on some of the things that Scott and Asbjørn have said. I mean, really, it resonates so much when you talk about people coming together to establish a space that is different from what the state has to offer. We often think in terms of and that's also kind of the critique that I think we should put out there a lot more, is that radicals sometimes tend to create spaces that are then impenetrable, and then there are certain rules there, and there are nice collective practices and some sense of horizontal governance or self-organization. But how much do we actually change society? How much do we actually change the system? We tend to sometimes focus too much on excluding ourselves to create spaces that are different, but we actually lose sight of the fact that we need to organize people, because fascism is organizing people. Fascism is converting more people every day. So as radicals, we need to find ways of caring for all of society, not just for the spaces that we have. And how do we do that? How do we have a perspective on social transformation that actually believes in freedom? Right? Because I think there's often a lot of pessimism in very radical spaces, in the far left in particular, is that it's just hopeless. People are just crap. Life is crap. And this kind of pessimism is not something, it's not healthy, because first of all, it blames people for things that the system, the capitalist system, the state is causing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So it is blaming people for systems of oppression. So that's not good, and we shouldn't have this kind of attitude, but actually think about creative ways of engaging more people, which is why I think practices of care need to also reflect that, because when we speak about care, and especially from women's perspective, care work is often very, very exploitative. It's very much exploited. It can be a source of oppression. So how can we actually create a culture of care that is different from the more traditional ways in which people are expected to show care and care work, which is invisible and just often a source of exploitation, which is why we say, especially in the women's movement, through organizedness, by being organized in all spheres of life, by creating alternative media, by creating alternative decision-making, by creating alternative families, actually. How can we democratize the family? So it's, on one hand, you're struggling against the state, against authoritarianism in your most private, intimate relations, whether it's between you and your partner, in your family, in your community. But at the same time, you must be aware of the fact there is a fascist system in the world that is threatening even the small pockets of safety and freedom that we do have. So how can we bridge that without separating ourselves from society, but also without compromising too much, right? So this is why, for example, we propose in particular autonomous self-organization even within movements. So the youth must be organized autonomously, the women must be organized autonomously, and so on and so forth, whatever makes sense, just so the needs of specific groups are not compromised, but they're actually rendered as agents of a wider participatory perspective. For example, we have so many different religious groups in Kurdistan, and many of them have been historically oppressed. They need to find ways of internally democratizing, while at the same time playing a role in building some kind of dialogue across each other, because sectarianism and religious violence is also a problem in Kurdistan, in the region in general. So it's also about looking after nature, it's also looking after life itself. So in that sense, all of our struggles, they should be much less kind of adopting this mechanic thinking of capitalism, that if we do this and that right, if we organize ourselves in this or that way, then we will all have equality and justice. We cannot measure equality, justice in grams and kilograms or whatever metrics we use. It actually needs to lead to social transformation in a meaningful way. And again, it is the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the most silenced that actually should be at the forefront of being able to determine that, which is why autonomies, even within autonomous spaces, are important. So autonomy as a way of, as a method, actually, as a method, not just as a goal. Because ultimately, when we look at it again from the perspective of the women's movement, our goal is not women's autonomy as such. Our goal is a free society in which we have abolished patriarchal violence, right? Like, there's nothing inherently special about women that we should organize autonomously. We organize autonomously because there is patriarchy and because we want to overcome it. So in fact, we need to really, really believe that freedom and justice in equality and whatever we want to call it is possible, and actually with that mindset organize. So that's why, for example, just to come back to the dangers on Rojava, when Kobane, which is the first city that defeated ISIS, was attacked first in September 2014. This was the first time so many new people became interested in the Kurdish struggle, for example. Over time, people went there, internationalists, including anarchists, died fighting in Afrin and other places, defending it against ISIS and the Turkish state. And when Afrin was then attacked and occupied in 2018, so many more people were there compared to the time just a few years before that when ISIS was attacking Kobani. What is that? It shows us that we have in the meantime actually managed to build relations with so many different struggles, and they all have something new to add. So many feminists in different parts of the world could share with us their experiences and vice versa. And this is why, again, when we say we need to defend Rojava, we don't appeal to states. I mean, the states are partly the reason why this disaster happened to begin with, and also why Rojava was put in a position where it had to rely so much on states and the US troops. We actually unite struggles. We are everywhere, our hands. So we need to stay hopeful, and we need to stay organized in all spheres of life, instead of always just focusing too much on how can I and my friends and my small groups that I know in my city, how can we organize? But in fact, look more broadly about how actually, what kind of methods can we find creatively to liberate people, save them from fascism.
Scott, did you want to jump back in? You had.
Sure, and I think how Dilar put it really is right on point. And I think as I was putting these notes together, I've been thinking a lot about Cheran recently, and sort of what's happening here with the emergence of all sorts of mutual aid groups and people coming together at a local level, outside of, you know, anarchist circles or this group circles or that sort of thing. There's been this huge emergence of energy and a desire to help and contribute. And I think one of the lessons that I take away from Cheran when I'm looking at what's happening where I'm at or around, and I'm speaking from a very US centric perspective, but is how the processes and organization that were put in place in the midst of a crisis in Cheran were crucial to sort of sustaining the movement beyond the crisis and to building lasting autonomy and to assuring that which was achieved remained and continued to grow. And so I think it's this moment where a lot of folks are coming together at these local levels and sort of meeting one another. And while obviously the focus is on immediate needs at the moment, I think something worth that I would like to offer as a suggestion is to keep in mind, like, what's our vision moving forward beyond once this most acute phase passes or at least subsides until it becomes terrible again? I don't know. But like, how can we sustain that which we're building right now? How can we bring people in? How are they being exposed to ideas of mutual aid and that sort of thing beyond notions of charity or just volunteering some time? And another concept kind of linked to that is one of territory, where Cheran, their sort of slogan that emerged almost immediately and they still use is for the security, justice, and reconstitution of our territory. And territory is distinct from land, whereas it's all that inhabits the land, also things like the wind and the sun, the knowledge that emerges through relationship with the land, the other humans, the non-human animals, and the ecology itself. And while we may not have physical spaces or an autonomous municipality or anything like that, we are building territory, at least in the forms of relationships and sharing of knowledge. And similarly, like, how can we grow and deepen those territorial connections into something bigger, into something that can move us from the mutual aid point to broader struggles against the systems of oppression that remain even after the coronavirus passes. And I think lastly, to speak to what Dilar was saying, what really struck me about Cheran is that they very much articulate their struggle as what they're for, what their aspirations are, what they want to achieve, as opposed to what they're against. So you don't see a posture of like, well, we're anti-capitalist or we're anti-state or we're anti-colonial. They say, you know, we want security, justice, we want our forests, our territory defended, and whatever system it is that gets in our way, by whatever name it might go by, we're going to fight together as a community to defeat it. And so I think sort of turning things on its head or from a different perspective is, what is it that we want to achieve? And then whatever it is that gets in our way, we'll fight it, be it the state, be it patriarchy, be it the cartels, whatever oppressive force it is. So that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. I was thinking a lot when all of you were talking about this moment where all these just huge flowering of mutual aid groups. I've, for the past 2 months, been putting together just a directory of collective care projects, mutual aid. And it went from like a couple dozen to hundreds and hundreds. And it's just a list of them, but it's been such an honor to just watch them grow and to, you know, see them together. But it isn't just this, by they're starting to understand that they're in a web together and interconnecting with each other and lending solidarity between them. But there's also a struggle between them, which I think is actually really generative in the ways you are all talking, where ones are asserting, you know, some of them are more people just suddenly having to help each other because there isn't any other help, but they have nothing, they see nothing beyond that. And while they don't, you know, it's varying degrees of sort of charity models, or just be nice to your neighbors or things like that, versus there's been a whole bunch of like people say, no, what we're struggling for something and something beyond this moment. And so I know a lot of those projects have been trying to articulate what the ethics are and what they're doing, using the language of what they're for, which has been really beautiful. Now we're trying to take care and give care, or we're aiming for, you know, forms of freedom. But yeah, I think when all of you were talking, I was thinking this is such a moment for us to really think about in this disaster, to grow the mutual aid projects that understand themselves as struggling towards something beyond this moment, to aspire to confederate them in ways which I think is happening organically, but also for us to understand, to try to do that at the same time, while we're also understanding that we're having to engage in forms of self-defense while we're doing these forms of mutual aid. And I feel like part of the more we can give each other what we need and take care of each other, the more that becomes our form of self-defense. Especially, I know I've been watching the rise of I've been in the Midwest of Turtle Island and have been from a car watching the white supremacist gathering in public, in close proximity without masks, saying, this isn't real, and watching sort of the rise of fascism asserting itself. And at the heart of it, I feel like they're afraid. They don't know how they're going to be taken care of. I don't like their politics, so I'm trying to be very generous here about them. I don't appreciate their sensibility, but I really think at the bottom of it is that their fear is going in a direction of fear of the other, of lashing out at others, because that's how they can think they can find ways to fulfill what they understand as well-being and all the other things that a lot of the spaces in this collection talk about in good ways. But then I see the mutual aid projects doing the opposite. Is like, we're scared, we're uncertain, we're anxious, we're in grief, and we're going to turn toward each other and figure out ways to strive more for collective care, more for solidarity, because that is what's going to get us through this moment. And I feel like for us to name that more explicitly as self-defense and anti-fascist work and community self-defense would help us move in that way. The other thing when you all were talking is I couldn't only have 3 people on this to talk about their spaces, and I hopefully someday all the voices in the anthology can come together or engage together. But while you're speaking, I was thinking the piece that I had mentioned at the beginning on this project called The Little Lentil was a piece of land that was occupied, squatted in the middle of a city again about 11 years ago now, and a bunch of farms created, etc. It's very ecologically and oriented toward food and autonomy and feminism and queer politics. And it was almost all French anarchists, I think 100% French anarchists 11 years ago that squatted it. And then they were in the disaster of the climate, refugee, I don't want to call it a crisis, refugees coming through their community in large numbers. And they made a choice just to be like, we have this space. It's about dignity, autonomy, and freedom, and people self-organizing together. So I think now their space has like 13 or 15 different languages and people from 11 or 12 different countries. And that piece really beautifully articulates precisely the growing pains of, like, you're dealing with a disaster and we respond to it different than the state and capital and patriarchy by opening up our hearts and our arms and our space. And that piece, as I mentioned in the beginning, they end up having growing pains over what does it mean to have to translate all their discussions into 10 different languages? How do the different cultures that have different understandings of how they make decisions, different understandings of gender? And I really keep coming back to that piece, all of the pieces, but that piece in terms of how do we struggle through to make our spaces not just for us, but for other people, and do it with grace and dignity. And that piece ends with, I think, we're still here. We're still here. and so I know we're kind of running out of time. I was wondering if we could just kind of go around, and all of us as rebels and radicals and other people that believe in freedom and are struggling for it, we're still here. And a lot of these projects are still here in various ways. Maybe each of you can comment on what does it look like to still be here, to still carve out new social relations and new social fabrics in this time, or whatever last little comment you want to make, sort of to wrap up. And I'll just close off at the very end. We can go back in the same order, or anyone can jump in.
I would just like to say that it has been just as inspiring hearing Dilara and Scott's comments, and also yours, Cindy, but also to read the book as it was to actually do all of the interviews. It's like seeing a bunch of dots with lines coming together to form a big web. and to see how these communities are not isolated. And I think this is the incredible thing that this book does, showing that these communities, maybe they're not connected, but they should be connected, and also how an inherent hope exists in humanity for similar structures to pop up different places independent of each other. And also I think it underlines the what you talked about, the need to be positive, the need to have hope, that there's gotta be, if it's happening so many places, there's gotta be something inherently not destructive in humanity, even though it's easier to see the destruction and to criticize. Still somehow there seems to be it, and it's really what this book brings out. And I hope it will inspire a bunch of other communities, and also the ones written about will read a lot about it. And I'm actually more interested to see what this book will spark. Hopefully this will be one of the sparks to lit the flame. Then also the book is wonderful itself, but I'm excited to see the effects. Thank you so much for this, Cindy.
I don't know how much I have to add. This has been really great, and it's been a pleasure to share the space with everyone. Wish we could see everyone else's faces who were joining us today, but thank you for being here with us. And I know that I tend towards the pessimistic side of things. I'm not a very hopeful individual, and this has been, well, materially, it has not been a difficult moment for me. It's psychologically been very challenging, as I imagine it has been for all of us. But to find hope in this book, I think it's really incredible that the different pieces show just the numerous manifestations and ways of people coming together and deciding for themselves. And I think about sort of Cheran and things happening in Mexico, where the government is taking advantage of the pandemic to continue construction on various neoliberal mega projects, while also shutting down the courts so people can't file appeals against them, and how indigenous communities are working to survive and resist and still fight for autonomy, and the mutual aid projects that have emerged here, and just the enormous I guess explosion of care and concern, of love, of solidarity, of resilience, of creativity that we're seeing in this moment, alongside all the loss and pain and suffering and grief, has been what I've hung on to in this moment. And this book and events like this are really helpful in that process. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to thank all three of you and everybody who's joined us, and all the contributors to the book. I think what we see when we look at struggles, no matter how small or big they may be, they're all meaningful, because they're all expressions of people refusing to bow down to oppression and injustice. And even if it's a small group of people just writing a rebellious slogan on a wall in an authoritarian regime, or if it's a very large-scale emancipatory project, or if it's all these struggles and movements connecting, they're all expressions of freedom. They all show that people are not inherently prone to enslavement and oppression. So in this sense, learning from each other's struggles, learning from past struggles, recognizing that there's so many, for example, on your part of the ocean, in this case, for example, the centuries-old, millennia-old struggle of indigenous communities, the ongoing struggles of of Black communities against racism, or, you know, everywhere in the world. There's so many examples that are incredibly, they're not inspiring, they're actually real. They are happening. And so in this sense, for example, Rojava's response to the coronavirus has been quite interesting, because people already have built over years these autonomous health systems. They are able to, despite the limits, they have ways of actually thinking about how can we go about it, or other things that happened in the past. When one region was attacked, the rest of the region was able to look after them, because they had systems of solidarity and self-determination in place, and self-defense. So our biggest self-defense really is our political awareness, consciousness, and organization. There are now tens of thousands of people in prison in Turkey. They're activists, they're community organizers, they're movement people, they're even politicians and journalists, but they still continue, even in prison, behind bars. They are continuing their struggle. So wherever we are, we can organize in the here and now, but we should always recognize that some of us are not at the very front of the fire. We're not behind bars, those of us here. We're not in the middle of war. So what can we also do to use the platforms that we have to amplify places where the fire is actually burning things down? So how can we become a light, a different kind of, a radical, lovely kind of fire, to be a torch for each other's resistance? And we can do that if we connect. So in this sense, I think there is hope to be found everywhere. But it will not come naturally. We cannot just expect the world to be better. We need to actively organize in all of the communities, and across communities, across nations, and across states. So in this sense, yeah, it's so great to see that this kind of sharing of knowledge, sharing of experience has also been facilitated with this book. I think it brings together so many different experiences. And yeah, learning from each other's struggles is part of the fight that we have to lead. So thank you, Cindy, for enabling that.
Thank you, three. You're the ones that it brought such beauty to this hour and a half. I'm so moved by all three of you being part of this. I want to end on three. I'm going to hold up the cover again. I don't know if I remembered to say it, but a dear friend, Jeff, designed this book and used this photo by Simone Cedillo, which is of Cheran, and it is of women and younger folks in struggle in their own community. And the book itself has the beauty of the fires. I think it carries it in your hand. So there's something about getting the physical copy. The picture is taped onto the cover with like Scotch tape that you can see in the image, is like we're making this world and we're holding it together ourselves. I'll do the AK plug, is offering the book now for 25% off on the website, but none of us did this book for money. This is all a labor of love and a labor of wanting people to resist and fight and believing in freedom. So I really want to encourage people to get the book, even if you get one copy, and read it together and try to have conversations around your own bonfires about it, and imagine what the world could be, and debate and discuss and see how these pieces spark your own ideas for what you're already doing. That's the only reason to do these books. I really feel like the book has to be its own bonfire and use it in that way. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I had asked that this event, all the funds are going to mutual aid disaster relief, and raised over $300. That money is being used to redistribute masks out to BIPOC communities in Turtle Island that are facing some of the profoundest devastation from COVID. And mutual aid disaster relief is trying to interconnect with all the other hundreds of mutual aid projects around Turtle Island to start creating some kind of confederation and a social fabric of us helping each other to build the relationships we need to think longer term, beyond having to just send each other things in this moment, to beyond creating structures that can get us through the longer term. So to me, I already see the beauty seeds of that. And I really appreciate all of you for contributing to that with tuning in today and your funds. And hopefully we can try to get more contributors speaking. I have this idea of creating a quilt of everybody speaking about their pieces. It's an audio thing you can listen to and share and debate and discuss. But on May 22nd, Firestorm Books is hosting another virtual event with two contributors to the book, Andrew and Modibo, who wrote about the Pan-African tradition and intimate direct democracy. So I think that will be a really moving event. They had a dialogue in the book, and they will talk to each other, and they will be talking in the Southern context. About the struggles of the Black radical tradition to create space for self-organization and freedom and resistance. And I just really want to end on, I'm always struck by the title, Deciding for Ourselves. I really do believe that, this, Jalar used the term magic in her piece, and I believe in, again, creating magical spaces. I feel like that's what we do as radicals, is we realize the possible, we realize the magic that's already there, and we take that and we make it happen in the real world, and we cultivate it and we nurture it and we keep the flames going. It isn't anyone else that's doing that but us. So I hope we can all try to look into ourselves and go, these things don't happen by magic, they happen through our magic that's already inside us, if that makes sense. The gifts we have to bring together to keep these going. And I want to hang on to end this I really think deciding for ourselves is a continual battle to honor the past struggles, the past beautiful examples, and the past people who've died trying to create and make these spaces, and to try to mend the world for them and for us and for those who will come after us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.